Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us at the MarketSite studio, we have James Francis, who's Chief Research Officer over at CRB Monitor, and we're going to talk about cannabis-related markets. James, it's great to have you at MarketSite. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's talk about the cannabis-related equities market, how it's been performing year to date, and where you're seeing the investment opportunities.
Well, I would say it's an understatement to say that cannabis has struggled this year. It's actually down about 50% across the board. So things like the global macroeconomy has affected it, but then there are other headwinds as well, such as the illicit market, which provides lots of competition for the market, and also, of course, the very slow, gradual move toward legalization, which investors really don't seem to have the appetite for. But opportunities exist. I mean, now the market is really cheap. I mean, it's down 50% year to date, but actually it's been down for a lot longer. Stocks are really, really reasonably priced now, and the market is not really going anywhere. CRB Monitor tracks more than 65,000 businesses. That industry employs more than 450,000 people. It's a thriving industry. And CRB Monitor also tracks 1,400 publicly traded companies. So it really is not, that market is not going anywhere. So for investors that are patient, it's a great buy right now.
Yeah, those numbers are quite robust when you think about the amount of people that are employed and the amount of companies that are related to it. And last time you guys were on the show, we spoke about the Nasdaq CRB Monitor Global Cannabis Index, named Herbal, right? Yeah. Quite appropriate there. Let's take a closer look about the weighting methodology,
Sure.
In particular the risk factor of strength of theme, or what you call SOT.
Well, strength of theme is a factor that I've developed over the last couple of years. And what it is a measure of what I would call, operational footprint in the market, right? And so while, Nasdaq CRB Monitor Global Cannabis Index does use market cap as a weighting scheme, it also uses this strength of theme factor as an adjustment to market cap. And what it does is just makes it a much more sort of realistic measure, a representation of a company's footprint in the industry. And so you might have two companies that have very similar market cap, but because of their strength of theme, we might weight them very differently. And I can talk a little bit about strength of theme.
Yeah, what's an example of a theme that you'd be looking to identify?
Okay, so the strength of theme is really a company's measure of overall exposure, or let's call it diversification within that industry. Okay, and the way that we do that is we look straight through the publicly traded companies, down through their subsidiary businesses to their licensing. And the licensing, where we track more than 150,000 licenses at CRB Monitor, we're able to scrape all of the data off of those licenses and then be able to measure things like geographic diversification, license type diversification, all of the license statuses. One company might have a lot of licenses that are sort of inactive status, and that's a lot less effective, let's say, than a company that has all active license status. We also combine those factors with what we would call a sentiment factor, which scrapes data off of millions of documents over the last year, looking for investor sentiment versus, relative to each company. And so we normalize all of those factors and we combine them to create a strength of theme factor. And what we find is that, companies that are small cap that may not have much weight in the index, they might actually have their weight increased by strength of theme, because it's a very forward-looking measure. It's going to hopefully predict, maybe a slightly better risk-adjusted return.
It's good to have that kind of flexibility. So my question to you is, what's the performance been like for the index since launch?
Well, since the index is launched, which is back in November of 2021, the index is down about 64%, which is very consistent with all the other indexes. But strength of theme is not really a measure that is going to have this monumental outperformance. It's not really about that. It's about managing risk. It's about assessing companies a little bit differently. And I think that what you get is just sort of incrementally better risk-adjusted returns over time. And where I see it working really well is going forward when, let's say, we move toward legalization and this index opens up to tons of more companies.
Right.
We're looking at perhaps U.S. legalization, and this index, which currently doesn't allow anything that has U.S. marijuana touch points, eventually it will. you'll have, instead of a 25 stock index, a 50 stock index or a 100 stock index. Strength of theme will have a much broader distribution over a lot more companies. And I think at that point, it'll become much more meaningful as a measure of risk.
Because when you look at companies, it doesn't necessarily have to be growers. I mean, you think about all the other distribution networks and manufacturing, all those companies start to fit into this index as well once you kind of get that, the legalization, if you get it in the U.S.
Right. And bear in mind right now that because marijuana is still DEA Schedule I narcotic, it's considered illegal in the U.S. in the eyes of the U.S. federal government.
Right.
And so this index and many other indexes cannot really use any of the stocks that have U.S. touch points. But it goes a lot further when you find legalization, because companies now are forced to perform, to do all their operations within the confines of one state. Okay, so you'll have a cultivator, and you'll have a manufacturer-producer, and you'll have a retail dispensary, all managed by the same company, right? They're all basically subsidiaries of the same company. And the problem there is that if a company is much better at being a cultivator, it really has to be within that sort of vertical integration. And it sort of hamstrings a lot of companies currently.
So when you think about growth areas, in longer term opportunities, what would you advise investors to look into?
Well, as a sort of index creator, like I am, we look at a broad, diversified basket of equities, and the herbal index really is just that. It's what we would consider the broadest, most investable expression of the legal cannabis market. And over time, I think we're going to see lots of things happen in the industry, that are going to make it, a much more attractive investment. And that's why investors want to get in now. Things like the DEA removing marijuana from Schedule I. Just like the FDA potentially approving drugs that are, cannabis derived. And then you have things like the Safe Banking Act, which is getting closer to bipartisan approval in Congress. And then, of course, the path toward legalization, right? All of those things are going to be positive measures in the market. And that's why our index is really the place to be to anticipate all of those things. I wouldn't recommend sort of single stock investment, because you're not really going to be able to diversify out all your specific risk. However, if you're actually looking for areas of growth, what I see currently, I think the edibles market is something that's going to grow very quickly. It's sort of this multi-generational, very widely accepted, product that's produced by cannabis industry. That's not going away. The other one that I think is sort of more into the future, but not too far, is the market for cannabis-infused beverages. Now, I really believe that is eventually a game changer, particularly with companies like Constellation Brands that has invested very heavily in canopy growth. I think that's their eye toward the future of the beverage market. You've got possibilities are endless there, where you'll see beverages being served in a bar right next to the alcoholic beverage, and you'll have cannabis-infused beverages in liquor stores, and you'll have cannabis-infused beverages being served at
think
weddings.
of all those companies that could potentially enter the index, where they might not necessarily be manufacturers, but they are distributing the product. So it could be some of your larger consumer packaged names that enter the index as well.
And so the key really is that first step. DEA removes from Schedule I. You'll start getting the FDA approving cannabis-derived drugs, and then you'll have pharmaceutical companies come in. You'll have the beverage market with the beverage companies coming in, and maybe tobacco companies come in. And that's why I believe that this is really a great time to invest now that the market has been down so much.
All right, James, we appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.